A routine day, a moment of reckoning. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm, golden hue over the bustling city streets as Marcia Wilson adjusted her rearview mirror. The last rays of daylight danced through the car windows as she navigated the familiar route home. It had been an exhausting day, the kind where every moment felt like a test of endurance, but there was also a deep sense of fulfillment lingering in her chest. Today marked exactly 1 month since her appointment as the new police chief of her precinct, an achievement that was nothing short of historic. Marcia wasn't just any new chief. She was the first black woman to hold this position in a city that had long been divided along racial lines. It was a triumph not just for her, but for everyone who had silently rooted for her along the way. Those who believed in justice, equality, and the kind of change that seemed impossible until it happened. But Marcia knew better than to bask in the glow of this victory for too long. The hard work was only just beginning. Her mind drifted back to her childhood, to the memories of watching her father, a fierce advocate for civil rights, battle systemic injustices in the very city she now led. He had been a beacon of hope, tireless in his pursuit of equality, and he had instilled in Marcia a deep sense of duty, a calling to not just challenge the system, but to transform it from within. Becoming a police officer had never been about power for her. It was about reform, about ensuring that the justice her father had fought so hard for was upheld for all people, regardless of their race, gender, or socioeconomic background. Growing up, Marcia had seen firsthand the struggles her community faced: discrimination, economic disparities, and the constant tension between residents and law enforcement. These were not abstract concepts to her. They were realities that shaped her identity. So when she decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, she knew it wouldn't be easy. Being a black woman in a field dominated by white men meant facing barriers at every turn. But Marcia was no stranger to obstacles, and each one only fueled her determination to rise through the ranks. Her career had been marked by a series of triumphs and setbacks. As a rookie, she had to constantly prove herself, not just to her colleagues, but to the very communities she was sworn to protect. Every promotion, every accolade, came with its own set of challenges, but Marcia wasn't motivated by titles or recognition. She was driven by the need to make real, lasting change. That change was now her mission as the newly appointed chief of a precinct notorious for its conservative views and strained relationships with minority communities. She had made a promise to herself, and to her father's memory, that she would use her position to bridge the divide between law enforcement and the people it served. This was not going to be easy, and Marcia knew it. But if there was one thing she had learned in her years of service, it was that real change required grit, resilience, and a willingness to stand firm, even in the face of resistance. As she drove through the city's streets, which were now bathed in the dusky glow of early evening, her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden, blinding flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. A police cruiser, sirens blaring, pulled up directly behind her. Instinctively, Marcia checked her speed, well within the limit. Confused, she guided her car to the side of the road and waited, wondering what she had done to warrant the stop. The cruiser came to a halt behind her, and 2 white male officers stepped out, their movements slow and deliberate, as if to assert their authority before they had even spoken a word. Marcia watched them approach in her side mirror, her heartbeat steady, but her mind racing. Something about their demeanor was off. This didn't feel like a routine stop. The way they moved, the subtle hints of superiority in their body language, told her this was more than just a traffic violation. Officer Stevens, the taller of the two, rapped his knuckles on her window. His partner, Officer Harris, stood back, arms crossed, surveying the surroundings as though preparing for something more significant than a simple stop. Marcia rolled down her window, maintaining a calm expression despite the tension she felt building in the air. There was a quiet resolve in her eyes, the kind of focus that only years of navigating the nuances of power dynamics could instill. "License and registration, ma'am," Stevens said, his tone firm and dismissive. There was no courtesy in his voice, No sense of professionalism that Marcia would expect in a standard stop. She handed over her documents without a word, her silence a deliberate choice. She wasn't going to make this easy for them. Stevens glanced over her license briefly, then back at her with a look that made it clear he didn't think she belonged here. "What are you doing in this part of town?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge of suspicion. Marcia felt the weight of the question. It wasn't just a probe into her location, it was an interrogation of her very right to exist in this space. She had seen this kind of interaction play out too many times before, had heard too many stories from friends, family, and community members. But now, it was happening to her, and the irony wasn't lost on her. These officers had no idea who they were dealing with. "I live around here," she replied evenly, her voice betraying none of the frustration she felt. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing her rattle. Officer Harris, the quieter of the two, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. We need to know what you're doing here at this time." Suspicious activity. Marcia almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. She knew this was a tactic, a way to assert control, to remind her that her presence was under their scrutiny. It was the same playbook officers like Stevens and Harris had used for years, targeting black drivers for no reason other than the color of their skin. But Marcia wasn't going to let them off easy. She could have ended the exchange in an instant by revealing her identity as their new chief of police, but she decided against it. This was a moment of reckoning, and she wanted to see it through. "I'm on my way home," she said calmly, offering no more information than necessary. She had nothing to prove to them. Stevens's eyes narrowed, clearly unsatisfied with her response. "Step out of the vehicle, Mom," he said, his voice laced with authority. Marcia paused, considering her next move. She could comply, let the charade continue a little longer, or she could end it now by asserting her authority. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. Two officers, so sure of their power, had no idea they were trying to intimidate their new boss. The thought almost amused her, but she remained composed. Instead of getting out, Marcia looked directly at Stevens. "Do you know who I am?" she asked, her voice steady, but with an edge that made the air between them thicken. The question hung there, a challenge that threw both officers off balance. They exchanged uncertain glances, clearly not expecting this turn in the conversation. The subtle shift in their posture told Marcia everything she needed to know. They had no idea. She had the upper hand now. "Should I?" Stevens asked, his bravado faltering for the first time. A small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corners of Marcia's mouth. "I'm the new chief of police," she said, her voice calm but powerful. "And I think you're going to want to rethink how you're handling this situation." The silence that followed was palpable, a moment of unmasking, where the fragile veil of authority Stevens and Harris had tried to wield crumbled before their eyes. Their smug confidence evaporated, replaced with uncertainty and the stark realization that they had made a grave mistake. Marcia didn't wait for them to respond. She rolled up her window, her pulse steady, and waited for them to figure out their next move. This was no longer just about a traffic stop. It was about power, race, and the very system she had sworn to reform. The weight of authority. The next morning, Marcia Wilson sat in her office at the precinct, her eyes focused on the stacks of reports piled up on her desk. The soft hum of activity outside her door provided a constant reminder that this wasn't just any precinct. It was hers now, and yesterday's encounter with Officers Stevens and Harris weighed heavily on her mind. She had always known that her appointment as chief would be met with skepticism, but the reality of the situation was becoming more apparent with each passing day. The precinct itself had a long history, one that was deeply intertwined with the city's struggles over race and authority. For decades, the officers who had worked here were part of a system that was slow to change, and for many, the appointment of a black woman to the role of chief was not just an anomaly, but a direct threat to the status quo. She knew she had a long road ahead, but she hadn't expected to face such blatant disrespect from her own officers so soon. Marcia had always been prepared for resistance. It had been a constant in her career. As a young officer, she had often been the only black woman in the room, the only voice that spoke from a perspective that others didn't understand, or worse, didn't want to understand. But she had learned early on to let her actions speak louder than her words. In a system built to suppress those who didn't fit the mold, she had risen through sheer determination, proving time and again that she was not only capable but exceptional. Her work ethic and commitment to justice had earned her this role, but she knew that wasn't enough to gain the respect of every officer under her command. As she sat there, the weight of her new responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible force. She had been entrusted with the leadership of a department that was in desperate need of reform, but she was under no illusions about how difficult that would be. She wasn't just facing the challenges of running a precinct. She was facing the embedded culture of policing that had long been resistant to change. The incident with Stevens and Harris wasn't just about them as individuals. It was symptomatic of a deeper problem that would take more than a few policy changes to fix. Her office was quiet, a contrast to the bustle outside. The walls were decorated with commendations, pictures of her at various stages of her career, and a few personal touches. A framed photograph of her father, the civil rights activist who had inspired her to enter law enforcement, and a small plaque with the words, "Strength through Justice," engraved on it. A gift from a fellow officer years ago. These mementos were constant reminders of why she had chosen this path, but they also served as a reminder of the expectations she had placed upon herself. She had spent years on the front lines, patrolling the streets of the very neighborhood she was now tasked with protecting as chief. She knew the stories of these communities intimately, knew the faces of those who had been ignored, harassed, and pushed aside by a system that seemed to view them as less than human. And now, sitting behind the desk that symbolized her authority, she felt the immense pressure to be more than just a leader. She had to be a symbol of hope for the community and a beacon of change for the department. The sudden knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice steady but curious. Lieutenant Teresa Morales stepped inside, her face serious but supportive. Teresa was one of the few people in the precinct Marcia trusted implicitly. A Latina woman with nearly 2 decades of experience in law enforcement, Teresa had faced her own battles within the system. She understood the complexities of being a woman of color in a male-dominated field, and more importantly, she understood the nuances of leadership. Marcia had made sure to keep Teresa close since her appointment because, in many ways, they were kindred spirits, both navigating a world that wasn't built for them. "Chief," Teresa said, nodding as she took a seat across from Marcia, "we need to talk about what happened last night with Stevens and Harris." Marcia leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly drumming the surface of the desk. "I figured this conversation was coming," she replied, a hint of resignation in her voice. Teresa placed a folder on the desk, sliding it toward Marcia. "I've already started receiving complaints." Word spread quickly after the stop. "Some of the officers are unsettled. They're saying you overstepped, that you embarrassed Stevens and Harris in front of their peers." Marcia raised an eyebrow, her expression hardening slightly. "Embarrassed them? I didn't even get out of the car, Teresa. They pulled me over without cause, interrogated me like I was a suspect, and treated me with blatant disrespect. That's what they should be embarrassed about." Teresa nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. "I know, and I agree with you, but you know how this goes. Stevens and Harris are popular in the department, especially among the older officers. They've been here a long time, and they're not used to being challenged, especially not by someone they see as an outsider." Marcia sighed, her eyes drifting toward the window for a moment. She had expected this kind of pushback, but hearing it articulated by Teresa brought it into sharper focus. This wasn't just about 2 officers being put in their place. It was about the entire department coming to terms with the fact that things were going to be different now. "They see me as an outsider because I don't look like them," Marcia said, her voice low but firm. "But that's exactly why I'm here. This precinct needs to change, Teresa. The way they treated me is the way they've been treating people in this community for years, and it's unacceptable." Teresa leaned forward slightly, her gaze intense. "I'm with you, Marcia. You know I am. But this is going to get worse before it gets better. Stevens and Harris aren't just going to let this go. They're already gathering support from some of the other officers, and I've heard rumors that they're planning to file a formal complaint." Marcia clenched her jaw. A formal complaint against her. For what? Doing her job. The thought angered her, but she knew she couldn't let her emotions get the best of her. This was part of the fight, the long, arduous battle she had signed up for when she took this position. It wasn't just about changing policies. It was about changing mindsets, and that was always the hardest part. "I'm not backing down," Marcia said, her voice resolute. "If they want to file a complaint, let them. But they'd better be ready to explain why they pulled over their own chief without any justifiable cause. And if they can't, then they'll have to deal with the consequences of their actions." Teresa smiled faintly, a glimmer of admiration in her eyes. "That's what I expected you to say." Marcia returned the smile, albeit briefly. She appreciated Teresa's loyalty and support, but she knew that the road ahead was going to be fraught with obstacles, many of them coming from within her own department. The truth was, the precinct was still adjusting to the reality of her leadership, and many of the officers were resistant to the kind of change she represented. It wasn't just about her being a black woman. It was about the entire system being forced to confront its own biases and failings. "I'm going to call Stevens and Harris into my office this afternoon," Marcia said, making her decision final. "We're going to have a conversation about what happened, and I'm going to make it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated, not toward me, and not toward anyone else in this community." Teresa nodded in agreement. "Do you want me to be there?" Marcia shook her head. "No, I'll handle it on my own. But I need you to keep an eye on things around the precinct. If anyone starts stirring up trouble, I want to know about it." "Consider it done," Teresa replied, rising from her seat. She hesitated for a moment before speaking again, her voice softening. "Marcia, just be careful. You've already made waves, and there are people here who don't want to see you succeed. You've got a lot of allies, but you've also got enemies. Don't underestimate them." Marcia met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "I never do." As Teresa left the office, Marcia took a deep breath and leaned back in her chair, her mind swirling with thoughts of what was to come. She had always known that leadership was a delicate balance between strength and diplomacy, but this felt different. The forces she was up against weren't just external. They were embedded within the very institution she now led. She spent the next few hours reviewing the files on Stevens and Harris, noting their long histories with the department. Both officers had been with the precinct for over a decade, and their records were mostly clean. But Marcia knew that clean records didn't always tell the whole story. There were plenty of officers who had never been formally reprimanded, but were known for their aggressive tactics, their condescending attitudes toward minority communities, and their tendency to abuse the power of the badge. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Marcia called Stevens and Harris into her office. The two men entered with a palpable sense of discomfort, their earlier bravado replaced with a cautious deference. Stevens, the taller of the two, looked particularly uneasy as he stood before Marcia's desk, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out of the situation. "Sit down," Marcia said, her tone firm but not unkind. The two officers complied, sitting in the chairs opposite her desk. There was a brief, awkward silence as Marcia regarded them both, her eyes unreadable. "I think we need to have a conversation about what happened last night," she began, her voice calm but authoritative. "You pulled me over without cause. You questioned me in a way that was not only disrespectful but inappropriate. And I'm not just saying that because I'm your chief. I'm saying it because it was wrong." Stevens shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Harris remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Chief," "We didn't know it was you," Stevens began, his voice defensive. "We were just following procedure." "That's exactly the problem, Officer Stevens," Marcia interrupted, her voice sharp. "Your procedure needs to change. You pulled me over because I'm a black woman driving in a neighborhood that you didn't think I belonged in. You didn't ask me for my destination or give me the benefit of the doubt. You assumed that I was suspicious based solely on how I looked." Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but Marcia held up a hand to stop him. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice growing firmer. "This isn't just about me. This is about how you, and other officers like you, treat people in this community. You pull over black drivers at a higher rate than any other demographic, and you do it without just cause. That stops now." Harris finally spoke up, his voice quiet but earnest. "We didn't mean any harm, Chief. We were just doing our jobs." "No, you weren't," Marcia replied, her gaze intense. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to profile and intimidate. And as long as I'm the chief of this precinct, I will not tolerate this kind of behavior." The two officers remained silent, the weight of Marcia's words hanging heavily in the air. They knew, as she did, that this was a turning point, a moment that would define their future in the department. Marcia leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Stevens and Harris. "I'm giving you both a chance to prove that you can do better. But make no mistake, this is your one and only warning. If I hear of anything like this happening again, you will be held accountable. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Chief," they both muttered, their voices subdued. Marcia nodded, satisfied for the moment. "Good. You're dismissed." As the two officers left her office, Marcia felt a mixture of relief and resolve. She had made her stance clear, but she knew this was only the beginning. The culture of the precinct wasn't going to change overnight, and there would be more battles ahead. Battles not just against the systemic issues she was trying to dismantle, but against the very people who were supposed to be on her side. But Marcia was ready. She had always been ready. And no matter how much resistance she faced, she would continue to push forward, because this wasn't just about her. It was about the community she had sworn to protect and the justice her father had fought for all those years ago. The deep roots of resistance. Marcia Wilson sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she stared at the screen in front of her. The document was open, a detailed plan she had been working on for weeks to reform the precinct. It outlined everything from new community outreach programs to strict accountability measures for officers, including mandatory de-escalation training and racial bias assessments. It was comprehensive, precise, and ambitious. But as Marcia reread the plan, her mind kept drifting back to the meeting she had just held with Officers Stevens and Harris. Their uncomfortable postures, the way they avoided her gaze, the defensiveness in their voices, it had all been a reminder of just how deeply ingrained the resistance to change was in this department. Stevens and Harris were only two of many officers who were struggling with the shift in leadership and the new direction Marcia was taking. For years, they had operated within a system that allowed them to bend the rules, to rely on old habits that often involved profiling and heavy-handed policing. Marcia's presence as the new chief represented a direct challenge to that way of doing things. She wasn't naive. She had expected pushback from some quarters. After all, the precinct had a long history of operating under a very different kind of leadership, one that turned a blind eye to questionable practices in exchange for maintaining order and keeping crime statistics low. But Marcia wasn't interested in playing that game. Her focus wasn't just on the numbers. It was on building a department that truly served the community with fairness and integrity. Marcia sighed deeply, running her hand through her short-cropped hair. The weight of the task ahead was daunting, but she had never been one to shy away from a challenge. She closed the document on her computer and leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. The precinct building itself was old, with cracks in the walls and floors that creaked under the weight of years of footsteps. The architecture was a relic of the past, much like the attitudes that permeated its halls. Marcia had spent her first few weeks in this office observing, listening, and taking note of the power dynamics at play. It was clear that many of the older officers, veterans of the force who had spent decades climbing the ranks, did not see her as one of them. They didn't trust her, and worse, they didn't respect her authority. A soft knock on the door pulled Marcia from her thoughts. She looked up to see Lieutenant Teresa Morales standing in the doorway, her expression serious but familiar. Teresa had become a close confidant in the short time since Marcia's appointment. The two women, both outsiders in their own way, had bonded over their shared experiences of navigating the challenges of being women of color in a system that wasn't designed for them. "Got a minute?" Teresa asked, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. Marcia gestured to the chair in front of her desk. "Always. What's on your mind?" Teresa sat down, folding her hands in her lap. There was a moment of silence before she spoke, her voice measured. "I've been hearing things, more rumblings from some of the officers. They're not happy about the new policies you're implementing, especially the racial bias training and the Community Oversight Board." Marcia nodded, her face calm but focused. "I expected that. Change is hard, especially for people who've been doing things a certain way for so long. But they'll have to get used to it." Teresa leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "It's not just grumbling, Marcia. I'm hearing talk about organized resistance, officers meeting after hours, some of the senior guys trying to rally support against you. They think you're here to tear apart the department." Marcia's jaw tightened. She had anticipated resistance, but the idea of officers actively working to undermine her authority was troubling. "Who's leading this?" she asked, her voice calm but tinged with steel. Teresa hesitated for a moment before answering. "Sergeant Jeff. He's been the loudest voice, especially since the incident with Stevens and Harris. He's got a lot of influence with the older guys, and they're looking to him to push back against the changes." Sergeant Jeff. Of course, it was him. Marcia had known from the moment she met him that Jeff would be a problem. He was a veteran of the force, a man who had spent his entire career operating under the old guard, and he wore his experience like armor. In meetings, he was polite but dismissive, often cutting her off with a thinly veiled condescension that infuriated her. It was clear that he saw her as an interloper, someone who didn't belong in his precinct. Marcia sat in silence for a moment, considering her next move. She could have easily confronted Jeff directly, but that wasn't her style. She didn't want to escalate the situation unless she had to. Instead, she needed to find a way to isolate him, to show the other officers that resistance to reform was futile. But how? "I'll deal with Jeff," Marcia said finally, her voice steady. "But we need to be smart about this. I don't want to give him any more ammunition to rally the troops against me. If we make this a public fight, he'll use it to strengthen his position." Teresa nodded in agreement. "So what's the plan?" Marcia leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "We need to start talking to the officers who are on the fence, the ones who aren't fully aligned with Jeff but are afraid to speak up. If we can rally them, it'll undermine his support. I want to have quiet conversations, one-on-one, to remind them what's at stake. They need to know that this department is going to change, with or without them." Teresa smiled slightly. "Sounds like a plan. I'll start reaching out to some of the newer officers. They're less entrenched in the old ways and might be more open to what we're trying to do." Marcia nodded. "Good. And Teresa, let's keep this quiet for now. The last thing we need is Jeff catching wind that we're onto him." With that, Teresa rose from her seat and left the office, leaving Marcia alone with her thoughts once again. She stared out the window, watching the steady flow of cars passing by on the street below. The precinct was in a tough part of the city, a neighborhood that had seen more than its fair share of violence, poverty, and unrest. But it was also a place full of life, of people who were trying their best to get by, despite the odds stacked against them. Marcia had grown up in a neighborhood not far from here, and she knew all too well what it was like to feel marginalized, to feel like the people in power didn't care about you or your community. That's why she had joined the force in the first place, to be the change she wanted to see. But now that she was in a position to make real, systemic change, she realized just how deeply rooted the problems were. The culture of this department had been built over decades, and it wasn't going to change overnight. But Marcia was determined to dismantle the toxic elements, no matter how long it took. The resistance she was facing from Jeff and others like him wasn't just about her race or gender. It was about power. They didn't want to lose the power they had been accustomed to wielding without question. Later that day, Marcia decided to take a walk around the precinct. She often found that stepping out of her office and connecting with the officers on the floor helped her get a better sense of the mood. As she walked through the hallways, she noticed the way some officers avoided eye contact, the way conversations seemed to stop when she approached. It wasn't universal, but it was there, a quiet, simmering resistance that had yet to fully reveal itself. She stopped at the desk of Officer Ramirez, a young patrol officer who had recently joined the force. Ramirez looked up, surprised to see the chief standing before him. "Chief Wilson," he said, standing up quickly. "What can I do for you?" Marcia smiled warmly, motioning for him to sit back down. "Relax, Officer Ramirez. I just wanted to check in with you, see how things are going." Ramirez sat down, visibly relaxing, but still a bit on edge. "Everything's going well, Chief. Just trying to keep up with all the new protocols." Marcia nodded, leaning on the edge of his desk. "I know it's a lot to take in, especially with all the changes we've been implementing. But I want you to know that I'm here to support you. If you ever have any concerns or questions, my door is always open." Ramirez hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Honestly, Chief, some of the guys are having a hard time adjusting. There's been a lot of talk about the new training, the oversight board. Some of them think it's too much, too fast." Marcia studied him for a moment. Ramirez was young, idealistic, and probably felt caught in the middle of a department divided. She needed officers like him on her side, the ones who were still forming their opinions about the new leadership. "I understand that," Marcia said, her tone empathetic. "Change is hard. But these changes are necessary. The way things have been going around here, it's not sustainable. We have a responsibility to the community to ensure that we're treating everyone fairly, with respect and dignity. And that starts with how we train and hold ourselves accountable." Ramirez nodded slowly. "I get that, Chief. I do. But some of the older guys, they're not as open to it." Marcia smiled. "That's why we need people like you, Ramirez. You're the future of this department. And if we want this precinct to thrive, we need officers who are willing to embrace change, even when it's difficult." Ramirez smiled back, a flicker of pride in his eyes. "Thanks, Chief. I'll do my best." As Marcia walked away, she felt a small sense of satisfaction. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. She knew that winning over officers like Ramirez was key to the long-term success of her reforms. They were the ones who would carry the department forward, who would shape the future of law enforcement in this city. But she also knew that for every Officer Ramirez, there were others who would resist her at every turn. Sergeant Jeff was already mobilizing his forces, and Marcia would have to be ready for whatever came next. Later that afternoon, as Marcia sat back at her desk, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. She opened it and stared at the screen, her heart sinking. The message was short, but its meaning was clear. "Watch your back, Chief." Marcia stared at the words for a long moment, her mind racing. It was a threat, plain and simple. A warning from someone within her own department, someone who wanted her gone. But instead of fear, Marcia felt something else rise within her, resolve. She had known from the moment she took this job that it wouldn't be easy. She had faced threats before, both subtle and overt, and she had survived them all. This was just another challenge, another obstacle in the long fight for justice and equality. She wasn't going anywhere. Marcia Wilson had come too far, fought too hard, and sacrificed too much to back down now. If they thought they could intimidate her, they had no idea who they were dealing with. The fight was just beginning. The tipping point. The precinct buzzed with the tension that only comes when something monumental is on the horizon. Officers moved through the building with a nervous energy, some avoiding eye contact, others glancing suspiciously at one another. Marcia Wilson could feel it the moment she stepped into the precinct that morning, the kind of undercurrent that hinted at something boiling just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Marcia had spent most of the previous night staring at the anonymous message that had been sent to her phone. "Watch your back, Chief." The words were simple, but the weight they carried was undeniable. It was a clear warning, a reminder that her authority was being challenged in ways that went beyond mere disagreements about policy. There were forces within the precinct, and perhaps beyond, that were prepared to take drastic measures to stop her from implementing the changes she had promised. She hadn't told anyone about the message. Not yet. Not Teresa Morales, not the mayor's office, and certainly not the officers in the precinct. She needed to handle this carefully, strategically. If she reacted too strongly, she risked escalating the situation and giving her enemies exactly what they wanted. But if she did nothing, the threat would hang over her like a dark cloud, casting doubt on her ability to lead. Marcia's instincts told her that the tipping point was near. She could feel it in the way the older officers had begun whispering in the hallways, the way Sergeant Jeff had been holding court in the locker room, surrounded by a growing number of officers who seemed all too eager to join him in opposing her. She had been monitoring the situation quietly, gathering intelligence from her allies within the department, but today she knew things would come to a head. She entered her office, closing the door behind her. The early morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. Her desk was covered in reports, incident files, complaints, and reform proposals. But the papers seemed insignificant compared to the storm brewing outside these walls. There was a soft knock at the door, and Marcia knew without looking that it was Teresa. Sure enough, the door opened, and Lieutenant Morales stepped in, her face as serious as ever. "Morning, Chief," Teresa said, her voice low. She had a stack of files in her hands, but there was something in her eyes that told Marcia this visit wasn't just about paperwork. "Morning, Teresa," Marcia replied, gesturing for her to sit. "What's the latest?" Teresa placed the files on the desk, then folded her arms, leaning back in the chair. "It's about Jeff," she said, getting straight to the point. Marcia's jaw tightened. She had been expecting this. "Go on." "He's been meeting with more officers after hours. Not just the older guys this time, some of the younger ones too. I've been hearing rumors that he's planning something big, maybe a protest or a walkout." "A walkout," Marcia repeated, her voice calm but sharp with disbelief. "He thinks that'll stop me." Teresa shook her head. "It's not just about stopping you. Jeff's playing a longer game. He wants to discredit you, make it look like you've lost control of the precinct. If he can get enough officers on his side, he'll try to make it look like you're the problem, not him." Marcia sat back in her chair, her mind racing. A walkout would be a direct challenge to her authority, a show of force from within the ranks that could shake the entire department. And if Jeff succeeded, it wouldn't just be a blow to her leadership, it would undermine everything she had worked for. "How many officers are we talking about?" Marcia asked, her tone even. "I don't have exact numbers yet, but from what I've gathered, it's a substantial group, at least a dozen, maybe more. Some of them are just scared of change, but a few are true believers in Jeff's way of thinking. They don't want this precinct to change, and they see you as the enemy." Marcia's heart pounded, but outwardly, she remained composed. She had faced this kind of resistance before in different forms. Racism, sexism, the condescending attitude of men who thought they knew better simply because they had been in the job longer. But this was something else. This was insidious. A coordinated effort to not just resist her, but to tear her down. "What's Jeff's endgame?" Marcia asked, her eyes narrowing. "He doesn't strike me as someone who's just in this to stir up trouble for no reason. He's a veteran. He knows the consequences of a stunt like this. Teresa's expression darkened. He's gunning for your job, Marcia. Plain and simple. He thinks if he can create enough chaos, the higher-ups will step in and force you out. He wants to make it look like you can't manage the precinct, like you're too controversial, too divisive. If that happens, he's betting the department will look for someone more traditional, someone like him. Marcia's jaw clenched. The audacity of Jeff's plan wasn't lost on her. It was a textbook case of insubordination, dressed up as a concern for the department's stability. He wanted to frame her as a disruptive force while positioning himself as the savior who could restore order. Well, he's about to learn that I don't back down that easily, Marcia said, her voice steely. If he thinks he can intimidate me or force me out, he's in for a rude awakening. Teresa nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. I figured that's what you'd say. But what's the plan? We can't just wait for him to make his move. Marcia thought for a moment, weighing her options. She had already begun talking to some of the younger officers, trying to win them over to her side. But that wouldn't be enough to stop Jeff if he had a dozen or more officers behind him. No, this required something bigger. A show of strength that would remind the department that she wasn't just some figurehead to be pushed around. We need to get ahead of this, Marcia said finally. We'll call a meeting. Mandatory attendance for all officers, no exceptions. I'm going to confront this head-on before Jeff has a chance to rally more support. Teresa raised an eyebrow. A full department meeting. That could get tense. I'm counting on it, Marcia replied. But I won't let Jeff dictate the narrative. He wants to paint me as an outsider, someone who's here to tear things down. I'm going to remind them that I'm here to build something better. And if they're not on board, they'll have to find somewhere else to work. Teresa nodded slowly. All right. I'll make the arrangements. As Teresa left the office, Marcia stared at the door, her mind already racing with how to handle the upcoming confrontation. She knew Jeff was going to be there, front and center, likely with his group of officers standing behind him. This wasn't just about Jeff anymore. It was about the future of the entire precinct, and Marcia was ready to fight for it. That afternoon, the precinct's large briefing room filled quickly. Officers filed in, taking their seats in rows, while others stood along the back walls. The room buzzed with anticipation, the undercurrent of tension thick in the air. This wasn't a typical briefing. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. Marcia stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed, watching as her officers settled in. She could see Jeff near the front, his expression unreadable, but the way he stood, shoulders squared, chin raised, told her everything she needed to know. He was waiting for his moment, waiting for her to slip, to falter, so he could seize the opportunity to undermine her. When the last of the officers had taken their places, Marcia stepped forward, her voice calm but commanding. Thank you all for coming. I won't take up much of your time, but there are some things we need to address, she began, her eyes scanning the room. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Even the officers who had been whispering among themselves grew quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment. Marcia didn't mince words. I know there's been a lot of talk lately. Talk about the changes I've been making, about the new policies we're implementing, and about what my leadership means for this precinct. I'm aware that not everyone is happy with these changes, and I'm aware that some of you have concerns. She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the room was thick, expectant. But let me be clear, she continued, her voice growing firmer. These changes are not up for debate. This department is going to change, whether you like it or not. The old ways of doing things, profiling, excessive force, operating without accountability, are over. We are going to build a department that serves the community with integrity, that treats everyone with respect, and that holds itself to the highest standards. Marcia's eyes locked onto Jeff's. He didn't flinch, but she could see the tension in his posture. If anyone in this room feels like they can't be part of that, if you feel like these changes aren't for you, then you are free to leave. Marcia said, her voice unwavering. "But I will not allow anyone to undermine this department's future. We are moving forward, and I need every single one of you to decide, right now, whether you're with me or not." There was a murmur in the room, a ripple of uncertainty. Marcia could feel the weight of their gazes, some filled with defiance, others with doubt. She knew this moment would define her leadership. If she faltered, if she showed even the slightest sign of weakness, Jeff would pounce. Sergeant Jeff cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "With all due respect, Chief, some of us have been doing this job for a long time. We know how things work around here. And while I understand that you're trying to bring change, you need to understand that there's a reason we've done things the way we have. You can't just come in here and expect everyone to fall in line without question." The room held its breath. This was the challenge they had all been waiting for. Marcia took a deep breath, then stepped closer to Jeff, her eyes narrowing. "You're right, Jeff. I can't expect everyone to fall in line without question. But what I can expect is that you follow the law, that you treat people with dignity, and that you understand that this precinct is not your personal fiefdom. You don't get to decide how things are run. I do. And as long as I'm the chief of this precinct, things will be done the right way." Jeff's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes flashing with barely concealed anger. Marcia turned her gaze to the rest of the room. "I understand that change is hard. I understand that some of you are scared, or frustrated, or uncertain about what the future holds. But I'm not here to cater to your fears. I'm here to build a department that works for everyone in this city, and that means we are going to do things differently from now on." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room one last time. "So, I ask you again, are you with me or are you against me?" The silence that followed was heavy, but Marcia could feel the shift in the room. The officers who had been on the fence, the ones who had been swayed by Jeff's rhetoric, were beginning to reconsider. They could see that Marcia wasn't going to back down. She was strong, determined, and unwilling to compromise on what she knew was right. Finally, one officer stood up, then another, and another. Slowly, but surely, the room filled with the sound of officers rising to their feet in a show of support. Sergeant Jeff remained seated, his face set in stone. But Marcia didn't need his approval. The precinct had made its choice. The tipping point had arrived, and Marcia had come out on top. But as she left the briefing room, her heart still pounding, she knew that the battle was far from over. Jeff wasn't done with her, not by a long shot. And whoever had sent that threatening message was still out there, waiting for their next move. The real fight had only just begun. The battle lines drawn. The precinct was quiet after the meeting, but the tension in the air felt even heavier than before. Marcia Wilson walked down the hallways, her footsteps echoing off the cold tiles as she made her way back to her office. The confrontation with Sergeant Jeff still echoed in her mind. He hadn't said much after her ultimatum, but his silence had been louder than any words he could have spoken. It was a promise that he wasn't finished, that he had more moves to make in this fight. Marcia knew that she had won a small victory today. The majority of the officers had risen in support of her vision for the precinct, but she could sense that this was only the beginning of the real battle. The lines had been drawn, and the coming weeks would determine whether her reforms would take root or whether they would be sabotaged by the old guard. Sergeant Jeff wasn't the only one who wanted her out, and she knew it. As she reached her office, she saw Lieutenant Teresa Morels waiting just outside, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed. Teresa straightened as Marcia approached, her face serious but calm. "How did it go?" Teresa asked, though Marcia could tell from the look on her face that she already knew the answer. Marcia exhaled slowly. It went about as expected. Most of them stood up, showed their support. But Jeff stayed seated, and he's not backing down. He's still gunning for me. Teresa nodded, her expression grim. "I figured as much. I've been hearing more chatter from his circle. They're still planning something, but I don't know the specifics yet. Whatever it is, it's going to be soon." Marcia opened her office door and motioned for Teresa to follow her inside. She closed the door behind them, shutting out the rest of the precinct for the moment. The two women sat down, the weight of the situation settling between them. "I'm not surprised," Marcia said, rubbing her temples as the stress of the day caught up with her. "Jeff's not going to give up easily. He thinks he's protecting this department from me, but he doesn't realize that it's him who's holding us back." Teresa watched her carefully. "You know he's not just going to sit back and let you take control. If anything, today probably made him even more determined to push back. He's got connections higher up. If he can make it look like you've lost control, he might get them to intervene." Marcia frowned. This was the part of leadership she had always despised. The politics. It wasn't enough to be right or to have the best intentions. You had to navigate a minefield of egos, alliances, and power plays. She had known that becoming the first black female chief of police in this city would be an uphill battle, but the depths of the resistance she was facing sometimes caught even her off guard. She leaned back in her chair, looking out the window at the city beyond. The streets were busy with people going about their day, unaware of the internal war brewing within the precinct. But those people, the residents of this city, particularly the ones in marginalized communities, were the very reason she had taken this job. They needed someone who would fight for them, someone who would stand up to the corrupt elements in the department and push for true reform. And she was determined to be that person, no matter what it cost her. "We need to get ahead of this," Marcia said after a long pause. "If Jeff is trying to discredit me, we need to make sure we control the narrative. We can't just wait for him to make his move." Teresa tilted her head. "What are you thinking?" Marcia tapped her fingers on the desk, her mind working through the possibilities. "Jeff is trying to paint me as an outsider, someone who doesn't understand how this department works. He's playing on the fears of the officers who don't like change. We need to show them, and the community, that we're serious about these reforms and that they're already making a difference." Teresa nodded slowly. "You're talking about a public initiative, something to showcase the positive impact of your leadership." "Exactly," Marcia said, leaning forward. "We're going to launch a community engagement program, something visible, something that brings the police and the public together. We'll organize events, forums, ride-alongs, and most importantly, we'll give the community a direct line of communication with the department. I want transparency. I want the people to see that we're listening to them, that we're changing." Teresa raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious, but it could work. If the community rallies behind you, it'll be harder for Jeff to undermine you." Marcia smiled, though it was a tired smile. "Exactly. If we can get the community on our side, Jeff's whole argument falls apart. His supporters won't be able to justify resisting me if it looks like I'm the one making real progress." Teresa seemed to relax a little, her faith in Marcia's leadership clearly showing. "I'll start organizing. We'll need to get buy-in from some of the more trusted officers, Ramirez, Johnson, a few others. They can be the face of this to the community, help build trust." Marcia nodded, grateful for Teresa's support. "Good. And while you're doing that, I'll focus on Jeff. I need to find out who's backing him. He's not doing this alone." Teresa frowned, her worry returning. "Be careful, Marcia. If he's got support from higher up, this could get ugly." Marcia's face hardened. "I know, but I'm not backing down. Jeff needs to understand that I'm not going anywhere. This is my precinct now, and I'm going to run it my way." As Teresa left to begin organizing the community engagement program, Marcia sat alone in her office, the weight of leadership pressing down on her. The city outside seemed so calm, so ordinary, but inside the precinct, the storm was gathering. Jeff and his allies were not just challenging her policies, they were challenging her right to lead, to reshape a department that had been resistant to change for so long. She knew that she couldn't win this fight by playing defense. Jeff was smart, manipulative, and well-connected, and if she let him set the terms of this conflict, he could make her look weak, unstable, and out of control. She had to stay ahead of him, outthink him at every turn, and show both the department and the city that she was the leader they needed. Later that evening, Marcia found herself in a part of the city she hadn't visited in years. It was the neighborhood where she had grown up, a place that had changed in some ways but remained the same in many others. The houses were small and close together, the streets narrow and cracked, and the air filled with the sounds of children playing and car horns honking in the distance. She had come here not out of nostalgia, but because she needed to see for herself what her fight was about. This community, like so many others in the city, had long been neglected by the police, viewed as a problem to be managed rather than a part of the city to be served. It was these streets that had shaped her understanding of law enforcement, of justice, and of the deep mistrust between the police and the people they were sworn to protect. Marcia pulled up in front of a small house, its front porch lit by a single dim bulb. She stepped out of the car, her mind racing with thoughts of the coming confrontation with Jeff and the rest of the department. But tonight wasn't about them. It was about reconnecting with the community she had come from, reminding herself of why she had taken on this monumental task in the first place. She walked up the porch steps and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door opened, and an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair peered out. "Marcia," the woman said, her voice filled with warmth and surprise. "What a nice surprise." "Mrs. Jennings," Marcia replied with a smile. "It's been too long." Mrs. Jennings stepped aside, motioning for Marcia to come in. "You're always welcome here, you know that. Come on in, sit down." Marcia stepped into the small living room, its walls adorned with family photos and old newspaper clippings. It smelled of warm spices and the faint scent of lavender. She took a seat on the couch as Mrs. Jennings settled into her favorite chair across from her. "I heard about what's been happening at the precinct," Mrs. Jennings said, her voice soft but knowing. "I'm not surprised. You've always been a fighter." Marcia smiled faintly, the weight of her responsibilities feeling heavier in the presence of someone who had known her since she was a child. "It's been difficult," she admitted, "more difficult than I expected." Mrs. Jennings nodded slowly. "Change is never easy. And when you're trying to change something as old and stubborn as that police department, you're bound to meet resistance." Marcia sighed, leaning forward with her elbows on her knees. "I thought I was ready for it. But some days it feels like I'm fighting a losing battle." Jeff and his supporters, they're doing everything they can to push back, to make me look like the problem. "Do you believe you're the problem?" Mrs. Jennings asked, her voice gentle but probing. Marcia shook her head. "No, I know I'm doing the right thing. The precinct needs to change. The way they've been treating people, especially black and brown people, it's unacceptable. But sometimes it feels like I'm the only one who sees it." Mrs. Jennings smiled knowingly. "You're not the only one, Marcia. You may be the chief, but you're still part of this community. We see what you're doing, and we support you. The people here may not always trust the police, but they trust you. You've got more allies than you think." Marcia felt a lump form in her throat. She had been so focused on the battles within the precinct that she had forgotten about the people outside of it, the people she had promised to fight for. It wasn't just about changing the department. It was about proving to the community that change was possible, that they didn't have to live in fear of the very people who were supposed to protect them. "Thank you," Marcia said quietly. "I needed to hear that." Mrs. Jennings reached over and placed a hand on Marcia's. "Don't let them break you, Marcia. You've come too far, and you've got too much fight in you to let them win. This is your time." Marcia nodded, the fire inside her reigniting. She wasn't going to let Jeff, or anyone else, derail her mission. The battle lines had been drawn, but she wasn't going to back down. She would win this fight, because it wasn't just her fight. It was the fight of every person in this city who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or ignored by the system. The precinct was going to change. It had to. As Marcia left Mrs. Jennings' house that night, her resolve was stronger than ever. She wasn't just the chief of police. She was a warrior for justice. And warriors didn't back down. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The reckoning. The precinct was unusually quiet the next morning, but it was the kind of silence that felt thick and charged, like the air before a storm. Marcia Wilson had been awake before dawn, her thoughts racing through the events of the previous weeks, and especially the conversation she had with Mrs. Jennings the night before. The weight of her responsibilities was always present, but today it felt different, heavier, more immediate. She had decided that today would be the day everything came to a head. There was no more waiting, no more deferring or hoping that Sergeant Jeff and his supporters would come around. She knew better now. This was a fight for the soul of the precinct, for the integrity of the department she had been entrusted to lead. And the time had come to put an end to the resistance that had been building behind her back. As she walked through the precinct, she could feel the eyes on her, officers glancing up from their desks, watching her movements with a mix of wariness and curiosity. Some of them respected her, she knew that. Others were still on the fence, unsure of where their loyalties lay. But there was another group, smaller but vocal, who saw her as the enemy, who had been working behind the scenes to undermine her leadership from the very beginning. Jeff's group. She had always known this day was coming. The subtle insubordination, the whispered conversations in the hallways, the way Jeff and his allies had made it clear through their actions, if not their words, that they didn't respect her authority. They wanted her gone. They saw her reforms as a threat to their way of doing things, and in many ways, she understood their fear. Change was terrifying, especially for people who had spent their entire careers operating under a particular set of unspoken rules. But that didn't excuse their behavior. Today, Marcia wasn't going to wait for Jeff to make his next move. She was going to confront him. And all of them, head on. She reached her office and closed the door behind her, taking a deep breath as she prepared for what was to come. The folder on her desk contained everything she needed: complaints, misconduct reports, patterns of abuse that had been buried under years of complacency and neglect. It was all there, the evidence that would expose the rot at the core of the precinct, and it was time to bring it into the light. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Teresa Morales. "They're gathering in the squad room," Teresa said, her voice steady, but with an undertone of tension. "Jeff and his people. I think this is it. They're making their move." Marcia closed her eyes for a moment, steeling herself. "I'll be there in 5 minutes." She hung up the phone and stared at the folder for a long second, then picked it up. The weight of it was substantial, but it felt right in her hands. This was her weapon, truth, and today she was going to wield it like a sword. As she made her way to the squad room, her heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve never wavered. This was what she had been building toward since the day she was appointed chief. All the battles, all the setbacks, all the moments of doubt, they had led her to this. The tipping point had passed, and now the reckoning was here. When she entered the squad room, the tension was palpable. The large space was filled with officers, more than usual, and they weren't just here for routine briefings. They were here because they knew something was about to go down. In the center of the room stood Sergeant Jeff, surrounded by a small group of officers who had aligned themselves with him. Their faces were set in grim determination, a defiant wall of resistance. As soon as Marcia stepped inside, all eyes turned to her. The room fell silent, the charged atmosphere thick with anticipation. She walked to the front of the room, standing tall and steady, and placed the folder on the table in front of her. "Chief," Jeff said, his voice carrying a smugness that he didn't bother to hide. "We've been meaning to have a conversation with you." Marcia met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm sure you have. And I think today is the perfect day for it." Jeff glanced around the room, as if gauging the level of support behind him. Some officers were nodding subtly, while others remained still, waiting to see what would happen next. "I'm going to be straight with you, Chief," Jeff continued, his tone carefully controlled but dripping with condescension. "We've been doing things a certain way in this precinct for a long time, And while I respect that you're trying to bring change, a lot of us feel like you're moving too fast, that you're pushing things that don't align with how we've always operated. You're alienating your officers, and frankly, we don't think you're the right person to lead this precinct." There it was, the challenge, out in the open. He was calling her leadership into question, and he was doing it with the backing of those officers who had resisted her from the start. Marcia nodded slowly, as if considering his words. "I see. And what exactly is it that you're asking for, Sergeant Jeff?" Jeff squared his shoulders, clearly emboldened by the fact that she hadn't immediately pushed back. "We're asking for you to step down, voluntarily. Let someone with more experience, someone who understands the culture of this precinct, take over. Someone who has the support of the officers." Marcia let the silence hang in the air for a moment, feeling the weight of Jeff's words reverberate through the room. Some of the officers were clearly uneasy, shifting in their seats, while others were watching her closely, waiting for her reaction. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm, but with an edge of steel. "Step down. You think I should step down because you don't like the changes I'm making?" Jeff's smug smile faltered, just a bit, as he realized she wasn't backing down. "It's not just me, Chief. It's a lot of the officers. You're losing support." Marcia's eyes hardened. "Support? You mean the support of officers who've spent years operating without accountability, without consequences for their actions? Officers who have been allowed to harass, intimidate, and abuse the very people we're supposed to protect?" Jeff's face darkened. "That's not what this is about." Marcia picked up the folder and held it up for the room to see. "This is exactly what this is about. This folder contains complaints, reports, and documentation of misconduct that's been buried for years. Some of it belongs to officers in this room, and I've been going through it, piece by piece, uncovering the truth." The room went deadly silent. Jeff's confident expression faltered, and Marcia knew she had him. "I was appointed to this position to clean up this precinct, and that's exactly what I'm going to do," she continued, her voice rising with conviction. "I don't care if it's uncomfortable. I don't care if it challenges the way things have always been done. The days of turning a blind eye to corruption and abuse are over." Marcia's gaze swept across the room, taking in the faces of every officer present. "If you think I'm going to step down, you're mistaken. I'm not going anywhere. And if you're not willing to be part of the solution, if you're not willing to do this job the right way, with honor, integrity, and respect for the people of this community, then you need to leave. Because there's no place for you in this department anymore." For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, one by one, officers began shifting uncomfortably, murmurs rising from the back of the room. Some of the younger officers, the ones who had been unsure where they stood, seemed to straighten in their seats, emboldened by Marcia's words. Jeff, however, wasn't done. He stepped forward, his face tight with anger. "You think you can just come in here and destroy everything we've built? You think you can make us out to be the bad guys?" Marcia met his anger with cool resolve. "No, Jeff, I'm not here to destroy anything. I'm here to rebuild something that's been broken for a long time. And if you can't see that, then you're part of the problem." The tension between them was electric, and for a moment, it seemed like Jeff might explode. But before he could say anything else, another voice cut through the silence. "I support the chief." It was Officer Ramirez, standing up from the back of the room, his voice steady and clear. "I've seen what's been going on in this precinct for years. We need this change. I'm with you, Chief." A ripple went through the room as more officers began to stand, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging uneasy glances. But it was happening. Marcia could see it, the shift, the momentum turning in her favor. Jeff, however, stood frozen, his jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He could feel the ground slipping out from under him, and he knew it. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. Marcia's eyes never left his. "Yes, Jeff, it is." With that, she turned and walked out of the squad room, leaving Jeff standing there, his power crumbling around him. She had won. But as she made her way back to her office, she knew this wasn't the end. There would be more battles to fight, more resistance to overcome. But today, she had sent a message to Jeff, to the precinct, and to the city. Marcia Wilson wasn't going anywhere, and the precinct would never be the same again. Epilogue. A new dawn. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. The community engagement program that Marcia and Teresa had launched took off quickly, with officers participating in neighborhood forums, ride-alongs, and public outreach events that had once seemed impossible. Slowly, the walls between the police and the community began to come down. Sergeant Jeff, after realizing that his power had been irrevocably diminished, requested a transfer to a different precinct. His departure was quiet but decisive, a clear indication that the old guard was fading. Marcia sat in her office one evening, long after most of the precinct had gone home. The city outside was calm, the hum of traffic a distant echo in the night. She stared out the window, the weight of everything she had fought for settling over her like a comforting blanket. She had won the battle, but the war for reform was far from over. There would be more challenges, more resistance, more difficult decisions to make. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace. She was leading the precinct in the right direction, and the people, both in the department and in the community, were starting to believe in her vision. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Mrs. Jennings. "Proud of you, Marcia. Keep fighting the good fight. The city is watching." Marcia smiled, her heart full. She would keep fighting. For herself, for her father's legacy, and for the people who needed her to be their voice. The reckoning had come, and she had emerged stronger than ever. As she sat back in her chair, she whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning."